Greetings and a warm welcome to Intersections. Our passion here is about exploring truth through that lens of universality, through that quest of seeking to find connections between unexpected things, dissolving boundaries. Today's conversation is going to be with someone who is a beautiful soul, has in a very eminent way pursued success in the material world, but then has also found his soul calling over the course of his life and has been striving to create a sense of unity and clarity in a very messy and complex world between taking eternal truths from the spiritual traditions and finding ways to use those as guideposts for how we should act and react in the, again, messy milieu of life. So it's a great pleasure for me to have in our midst today Gurcharan Das. He is a celebrated author and thinker. He is the former CEO of Procter& Gamble in India and the managing director of Procter& Gamble worldwide on strategic planning. After 4 decades of working at the helm of the business world, he retired early to become a full-time writer. Some of his books, which have been bestsellers, include India Unbound and The Difficulty of Being Good. He's also more recently written an autobiographical account, Another Sort of Freedom. His writings have been featured in leading media, including The Economist and Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian. Gurcharanji, he graduated in philosophy with honors from Harvard University, where he was inducted into the 2013 Phi Beta Kappa for high attainments in liberal scholarship. And he also attended Harvard Business School, where over time, with his career accomplishments, he has been featured in 4 case studies. Gurcharanji, it's a joy and a pleasure to welcome you in our midst, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For those of us who are maybe unfamiliar with how we address each other in an Indian context, since I have guests from all over and I live here in the United States now, Gurcharanji, I just thought I'd let everyone know that it would be hard for me in the presence of someone as eminent as you not to append the G, on your name. And so while your first name is Gurcharan, adding the G is just a habitual, instinctual sort of form in India of, adding a sense of respect, and honor to the personage that is in front of you, which is certainly how I feel about you.
Well, suit yourself. Thank you.
My joy. Krishanji, I want to talk about that moment where you were at the helm of sort of, success in the mainstream, popular, traditional way of climbing that mountaintop of corporate life and getting to be, the CEO of a major, major brand and conglomerate in India. And then somehow you find yourself seeking and searching for something more. Can you talk about sort of when that drive and urge came to you to want to reframe and relook at life's priorities and where you're channeling your energy?
Well, I think a lot of us in our 40s, whether we are success or not, we ask ourselves this question. We say, is this what life was all about? And in my case, it was a global meeting that we had of managers of Procter& Gamble from around the world. This particular one was dealing with Pampers. I asked myself, well, surely there's a world beyond Pampers. I tried hard to concentrate, but this thought did not leave me. And other talks also added to the moment because I was a great cheerleader for India's reforms in 1991. And I'm talking now about 93, 94, when the reforms were actually in trouble. The leftists, particularly in the ruling party, the left wing of the ruling party, which were very articulate, felt that India had sold out to the market, to the multinationals, and the usual rhetoric of the left. And so I was actually worried whether the reforms. So I went home and told my wife that, I mean, there's more to life beyond Pampers and Vicks and wonderful products like Tide, all, Head and Shoulders shampoo and Pantene shampoo. all these products. There was a world outside, and I felt that I should do something about it. And so I shot off a telegram to somebody who I'd met about a dozen years earlier. He is what now the chief was the finance minister of India, who had spearheaded these reforms. And I told him, I said, why the hell and aren't you defending the reforms? And the guy knew that I had been spending my weekends as a writer. I'd been a weekend writer from my 20s. And he said, come back, you defend the reforms. and and so that added to the spirit of it. But the reality is that this discomfort began in my 20s. To be very honest, I did a philosophy degree at Harvard. I didn't do business. I had no clue what business was all about. I was in business by accident. After Harvard, I had a scholarship to go and do a PhD in philosophy at Oxford, but I had got cold feet at the last minute, and I had decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought. I wanted a life of action. And so I had gone into I'd answered the first ad I found, and they took me, this company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. But suddenly I'm transported from the ivy covered halls at Harvard to the dusty bazaars of India, selling Vicks to chemist shops and pharmacies and so on. And it was so after a little while, I missed the intellectual life. And it was then that my father said, look, you have the weekend. Why don't you use your weekend to do something that you really like? So I said, one Sunday morning, I sat down. I said, I'm going to write a play. And and then to give myself sort of moral force, I said to myself, well, Shakespeare too must have sat down to write Hamlet one morning like this. So I can do it. Now, no sane person compares himself to Shakespeare. But there I was, and that's how I started as a weekend writer. My friends played golf on the weekend, I wrote. And so, right through my 20s and 30s, I had been a weekend writer. I'd worn two hats. And so, by the time I was ready to quit the corporate world, I had the confidence. My plays had done well. They'd been performed, one of them off Broadway, another one at the Edinburgh Festival and on BBC. So I had the confidence. I knew I could write. That's how I decided to quit and change from being a business executive, to a starving writer. My wife said, "You're going to be a starving writer, are you?" So I had to tell her that, look, we did have some savings, and that we wouldn't be, our standard of living wouldn't go up, but hopefully wouldn't go down too badly.
Yeah, the beautiful early glimpse of your life story. There are many things in what you just said which really resonate with me, and I just want to kind of draw those out for our listeners. This idea that none of us needs to be slotting ourselves as just one identity in our professional sense. That within us, as they say, lie multitudes. And honoring those, appreciating those, giving space to those, even doing perhaps some of that self-expression in the weekends and as an avocational pursuit, if that's not necessarily a profession, and you just never know when those seeds that you're sowing and nurturing sprout into your next stage life mission. I mean, I'm hearing that in what you're saying, that sort of capacity to listen to the subtle stirrings of your soul and seeing them direct you and shape you, of course being grounded in the practicality of making sure that you've earned and you have savings and you can take certain risks. That is also a practical mandate and expectation in life that we should all have as caregivers of our family, but at the same time then having the adventurous spirit to be able to look beyond societal kind of just formulas for what a successful and good life is, to be able to take contrarian turns, which you did and what you just said. And And that sort of moment where that there's light beyond Pampers, as you said, was powerful, because it reminded me of a quote from one of the eminent disciples. She was the president of Self-Realization Fellowship for over 50 years. Her monastic name as a nun was Dayama. I'm not sure if you've ever come across Yogananda and his organization, but she led it, for all those years. She was one of his direct disciples. Anyway, so she said a couple of sentences I'm just going to read to you, because I saw that, in what she just said about that moment, which is, she said, the nature of the soul is power, bliss, love, eternal consciousness, omniscience, omnipresence. And so, in all of the things that man seeks in this world, he is trying to experience those qualities that are a part of his true nature. And it seems to me like in that moment when you were just like turning philosophical, zooming out and asking yourself, what about life beyond Pampers? That was your soul connecting with, this eternal omniscience in the world and saying, I have more to express, I have more to do, there's more service I can do to humanity.
And I was 22 when I wrote my first play. When you start young, you have one advantage, because if you are really creating a second life, and it can be therapeutic, because if you wear two hats, a Monday to Friday hat and a Saturday Sunday hat, if things are not going too well at work, you have the refuge of your book, whatever you're writing over the weekend. And if you're having a problem with a character on the weekend, you can always plunge back into your business life. And really, I mean, I think that point you made about multiple identities is absolutely correct. The problem with the world today is there's too much fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is all about privileging one identity, often a religious identity. And really, we are so many people inside us, and we are creating ourselves all the time. And so fundamentalism is fundamentally the poverty of this idea that you have only one overwhelming identity, where we should celebrate. And the Hindu ideal of the four goals of life: artha, dharma, kama, moksha. Artha means material well-being. Well, you got to make a living, and you have to you have to look after yourself and the family. The dharma, which is moral well-being, so you can sleep well at night. Then there's the third, kama, which is desire and pleasure. And what's nice about the idea of kama is that is it's one of the few the Indian subcontinent is one of the few places on the earth where they elevated the idea of desire to a goal of life, recognizing that this too is a potentiality that human beings should, a capability that we all have, and fulfilling that emotional, sexual well being is as important to any. And of course, the last one is moksha, which means freedom. And that's what the last book of mine is about. It's a very secular, non religious, non denominational idea of freedom, which I think all human beings ultimately seek in our lives. And usually it's freedom from expectations, society's expectations, your parents' expectations, your own. Those are the worst. The need to be somebody and not a nobody. That desire, the need to have to get premium treatment wherever you go. I mean, that's the kind of freedom you need. And that's why I thought the message that I was pointing to you when I was 5 years old, and I'm recalling to you the name, how I got it, was the idea of taking your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. That's the root. That's the root to real freedom.
So, for our listeners, Gurcharan ji and I was having a conversation just prior to launching the podcast, and that's where you shared the story about your name. Let's come back to it, because I think it will be a beautiful lesson, for us to learn from your story in just a few minutes. And before we go there, in what you've just said, Have you been sharing much about your message in youth forums, like in college or so?
Well, I mean, I put my energies really into my books as well as my journalistic pieces. So I do go occasionally to universities and I speak, but not a lot.
Somehow I'm feeling that there is much in your message that should be of deep resonance, to youth. I've had my own career be more focused on, the adult population, MBA students from 28 years onwards to executives in their 50s and 60s. But more recently, I've been taking a keen interest in the state of our youth and what we can do to bring to them a very vibrant kind of invitation to nurture and express their core spirit, right? In everything they're doing in a time of tremendous change in the world. And we're going to be passing on this mantle, of kind of taking care of our planet and of humanity to them. And in whatever stage it is that we were able to get it to. And some of them are deeply concerned about sort of what they think we're not doing, for the planet. But in just what you said, for instance, the idea that in your 20s, you had that sort of, I don't know, that drive, that forethought, that counsel from your father that allowed you to have the second life, over the weekends as a passion, and how each, can help be a balm and a soothing kind of force for the other. And but it also then prepares you for another, moment where you can perhaps even make it your main career years in the future. It's so beautiful to hear that your plays that you were writing from that moment onwards, where you took on that Shakespearean inspiration of one day he wrote Hamlet, which is just a great way of, motivating ourselves about our own latent capacities. That it has led to, even before you made it your vocation, you were able to get some of your plays, actually out there in off Broadway and beyond. I mean, I think there's a tremendous lesson there for a youth to take away, and among so many others.
Well, it also is a bit of an insurance policy in the sense. I mean, I thought was, as I said, therapeutic in a way, but also that so many people in their 40s or 50s find that it's the midlife crisis and may not become a crisis, but all of us have said, I mean, is this what life is all about? Surely there's something else. And if you have then something else that you are able to confidently do, then you also have the freedom to leave what you are doing. There's no point just quitting your job. I mean, I quit at 50 when the retirement age was 65. And there's no point quitting at 15 years earlier if you don't know what you want to do afterwards. A lot of people have that, and the nice thing is that if you've taken your hobby seriously, your weekend hat seriously, one thing is you have confidence. You practice over 25 years as a weekend writer or weekend stamp collector, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book called Working Identity by Herminia Ibarra. She's been a professor at Harvard and London Business School. And I really loved her very practical approach towards helping counsel people about how to make radical career changes, when we do. And she studied many examples, some who have succeeded and many who have failed at making those transitions. And one of the precepts that she has uncovered from the study of those who've been successful is kind of like basically what you're just saying, which is that they tend to not just take a plunge, from one to another, but they have been over a period of time running experiments, spending time over vacations or weekends or something, volunteering or just going and getting exposure or getting immersed in whatever that new frame is, keen about exploring and all that. And so they've been honing their craft and getting exposure and experience before they ultimately take that plunge, right? And that is what you're saying. You did.
Take your hobby as seriously as your job. You take everything that you do in that sense seriously, except don't take yourself seriously. That's the toxic direction to take.
Well, let's dive deeper into that. You're saying take your hobby seriously, take everything you do seriously. I mean, right there is actually, the kernel of profound, wisdom about the pursuit of, I don't know, some form of excellence in our conduct, right, in everything we do. But you also said don't take yourself seriously, and that reminds me of that conversation we had just before we turned on the podcast, where you were sharing the origins of your name. And also, as you talk about the origins of your name, perhaps you could talk a little bit about that period in your life of just the early formative years and the kind of orientations that existed in your family elders, because I thought that was a beautiful part of your book as well.
Well, as you've mentioned, I have just finished my memoir. By the way, I recommend to all your listeners to write a memoir. And why? Because the reward is that at the end you'll get to know yourself. Now, what could be bigger reward? And there's a difference between an autobiography and a memoir. An autobiography is a straightforward telling of your story. I was born here. I went to school here. I got married, and I went did this job, and so on, boringly to the end. A memoir takes what the memoir tries to do is tries to connect the dots of your life. It tries to make sense of what those different moments of your life are to find some kind of pattern. And when you find that pattern, you have that sense of aha. So you mean this is what I am like? Well, that's why I say that, all the philosophers from Socrates on said, know yourself. And if you can actually get to know yourself, what better reward? Whether you want to publish your memoir or not, doesn't matter. But the effort of reliving your life has huge rewards. For one thing, reliving your life is better than living it. And why? Well, because you can play God. You decide what incidents in your life you're going to include in your story. So you can play God, and you are the one who is in charge. And so, I mean, at the end, since you have to select, it's a bit of fiction anyway. You're not going to say, well, I had dinner at this place and this is what I ate for dinner. That's not very interesting. The big mistake we make, of course, as human beings is we like to look good, all of us. And if you try to look good on every page, then the reader will get turned off. This is a pompous ass. Why should I listen to him? Why should I read him? And if you make the opposite mistake and try to be too humble and talk only a lot of your failures, well, then the reader will say, my God, he's a loser. Why should I read him? So it's best to be yourself. But in the end, I was saying it's a work of fiction. And as Mark Twain said, there's no difference between fiction and nonfiction, except that fiction has to make sense.
Like that was quite educational for me.
You asked me to talk about the early period, and I'll tell you, I was lucky that my mother, she kept a diary. And so I appear on page 17 for the first time in her diary. And she says, he's a restless baby. Then 6 months later, she's, I have become a difficult child. She's calling me a difficult child. And a year and a half later, she's now calling me a troublemaker. So you see the direction that my life is taking. And at the age of 2.5, I learned to run. And I've been running ever since, often running into myself. And so that is the early phase in my life. And then I must tell you that they gave me the name Ashok Kumar. Ashok Kumar means the Prince of Happiness. A nice name, a Prince of Happiness. But my grandmother suspects that my mother, her daughter in law, has given me that name because she thinks my mother is in secretly in love with a Bollywood actor named Ashok Kumar, who was a big deal in the 1940s. And so she takes me to her guru. She places me at his feet and she says to the guru, "Give this boy a name." The guru, seeing me at his feet, calls me Gurcharan Das. So overnight, I've been transformed from the Prince of Happiness to the humble servant of the feet of the Guru, which is what Guru Charan Das means. And so many years later, when I'm grown up, I go to the Guru and I said, "Why did you give me that name?" Well, he says he has a good answer. He says, you know, it's a good thing to be reminded about humility once in a while. But then he gives me the best definition of humility I have ever heard, which is what we've talked about. Take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. And that, of course, is the freedom that is in the title of my book. And that leads to the fundamental belief. I, I believe in the kind of life we should live. We should live lightly. There's another Sanskrit word called laghima. Laghima means lightness. And when they talk about laghima, they say a light like a bird, not like a feather, meaning the bird has agency. And so that message is for me, although the guru gave it in some unusual circumstances, that message has meant, and that's kind of the theme of the book, the freedom when you not take yourself too seriously, you don't carry the burden of the world on your shoulders and you live lightly. Just like Yudhishthir in the Mahabharata, his chariot went about 2 centimeters above the ground. That is really one way to live.
So this message of taking your work seriously, but not taking your own self seriously, I imagine that was in some ways playing on your mind when you were able to make that bold and courageous and, not a very typical move at the age of 50 to step back from the trappings of, yeah, just power and influence and all the success in the business world to take your next calling seriously, to take your next call seriously.
Becoming a starving writer, as my wife called it. She was quite worried. She said, the paycheck won't come at the end of the month. I said, no. And she said, she didn't know how we were going to manage. But yeah, it's nice to be able to say that it was that freedom from the significance that we all seek. I'd like to believe that, but I'm not sure how many other factors were playing in my mind, to be very honest. I had hoped that I would also become a better human being as I transitioned from a businessman to a writer. But guess what? As being a writer now for 30 years, I have discovered that actually business people are better human beings than writers. And why? Because business people instinctively depend on others. They have to have customers. You have to satisfy your customer if you want to succeed. They have suppliers. Every businessman has a temptation to squeeze the supplier a little bit too much. And if you do too much, you get hurt because you get addictive component. They have to respect and be fair to their employees. Otherwise, they leave you. So a businessman depends on others. A writer depends on no one. I sit in this room. I sit in this room from 6 in the morning to 12, and I don't need anyone. I don't do emails in the morning. I don't answer the phone in the morning. I don't do any social media in the morning. I don't read the newspaper in the morning. I do nothing which will get me on someone else's agenda in the morning. And so that's how I've lived for the last 30 years. And because I don't need anyone else, I sometimes forget that the needs and I mean, I haven't tested myself, but I can only tell you that a few months ago, I went to a bookshop here near in my neighborhood, and the dealer, I knew the dealer, he knew me as a writer. And so I found that in the shop window, my book wasn't there. I had recently published this book. And so I go charging in and I say, "Hey, what's this? You know I'm an important writer. Why is my book not in the window?" And so he says, "Sorry," he blames it on on the shop boys or something. And then he places the book at the back. I said, "No, no, right in the front." See the ego? That's why I say that this is a work in progress, my dear fellow, taking yourself not seriously. It's definitely a work in progress. I try, but I ain't there yet.
Yeah, no, I think it is beautiful to think about ourselves always as work in progress. That's so inspiring and humbling to see that in you, with all that you've accomplished. I want to sort of turn to Steve Jobs for a minute, because there were a couple of things that you were saying which connected me with some of the things I've been inspired by from his life. So, you spoke about the memoir versus autobiography, and the memoir being more of a choosing of meaning, in your life, and a selective sort of narration of, those dots that connect in a way that gives significance to that life, that make you really feel like there's something worth sharing here with the reader and with your own self. And I remember him talking about this notion of how you cannot connect the dots looking forward, but you can connect them looking backward. And I think that's kind of the moment you're talking about, where you step back and you're encouraging people, everyone, to write their memoir, because as you step back, you can play God, you can choose what are the moments of significance, which connects with which, how is it that you got shaped by that event 20 years ago. I see that coming out in your writing, and so that's beautiful. And then in what you just said about being a work in progress and that ego coming in, he talks about just having this daily introspection on death, that, like, I'm gonna, one day this will be my last day on earth. Am I really motivating and driving and directing my energies in a way that is consistent with what I would want to do if this was actually my last few hours on the planet? And I remember a moment 2 years ago, a little bit similar to what you just said about that, moment in the bookstore, where I'd published my book. And as you know, in the publishing industry, there's a lot of hype created around, what are the metrics and numbers and promotions of what you're doing for your book, and what interviews are you getting signed up for, and what is the Amazon sort of, sales looking like in the first day and the second day and all of that. And at some point I realized, wow, this is completely taking the romance out of it for me. I mean, I was so joyful for 2 3 years in working on the book, and it was such a soul stirring journey. And here I am now getting embroiled again in the same kind of materiality of what it is that I'm trying to help question and soften. And so I did a thought experiment. The thought experiment I did is that I've died, at some point, and I've been reborn. And as a curious young adult, at some point, somebody comes over and hands me a book, and he says, you may want to read this book. It was written about 100 years ago by this guy called Hitendra, but it's a good book. Read it. And I'm reading this book, and I'm kind of like enjoying it, but I have no idea that I wrote that book in my previous incarnation. And and that made me realize, like, yeah, wow, in a few years, I'm won't even be aware that there's any kind of proprietariness to any of the things that one has put back into the creative flow of the world. It's just kind of nature giving and receiving from nature. Anyway, so that was a helpful thought experiment for me. And I'm curious what practices you have taken on in your life, given how much of the very core of your being is this, aspiration for, being humble, but there is also this thing in your nature where you never stop running. What are some practices that you found?
Well, the difference I find that when I'm here in the morning in this room, from 6 to 12, I often find, first of all, I'm drawn here. If I'm working on a book, I'm drawn here like a magnet from my bedroom. And then I start striking the keys. I mean, the keys start getting hit. And I don't know who's doing it, but the keys of the computer, of my computer start. And then writing begins to appear on the screen. And I'm not even aware very often of myself. In other words, when I'm really absorbed in the work, I forget myself. And it's that idea of self forgetting, which is what you were also talking about when you were writing your book. That that period, suddenly one thing you notice is time gets distorted. You say, oh my God, it's already noon. I thought it was around 10 o'clock. So you had lost 2 hours. And because you were so absorbed in what you were doing, but you were not aware of yourself. I think our unhappiness, our problems, our burdens come from that awareness too often of is my book on the bestseller list or not? That's what you were talking about. So if one could just write the book and then leave it for the market to the publisher, that's his job or her job to do. But they also know that we all have egos, and they make these book tours. And I remember one of my most enjoyable book tours was into the United States, when India Unbound came out by Knopf. And I went to these lovely bookshops and where I talked, and I was radio, NPR and television and all that. It was very enjoyable. But that was not the payoff. The payoff is when you forget yourself. And I think that's really the central idea of this freedom, that other sort of freedom that I'm talking about. Whenever I'm in that mode, I am free. But boy, suddenly you get a call from your publisher and you have to fly off to somewhere. There's a festival, there's a literary festival in Calcutta or Kathmandu or where. Every place in India now seems to have a literary festival. Well, you can be spending all your time, if you want, in literary festivals. And you got to say, stop it, no more, no more. I have my next book to write.
And there's so much in what you're saying about self-awareness and rituals, the 6 a.m. to 12 noon ritual that you have, spaces, right? Like, it's almost like you created a certain sanctuary for yourself in this room, which, by the way, intrigues me no end to, wonder what all those books are behind you. So grateful for all you do. And perhaps you can have the closing voice for us, Gurcharanji, in sharing what is it that you are most like, fired up about as someone who never stops running in this phase of your career and life.
The thing about it is the other day I was telling my wife that I sometimes have this uncanny feeling that uh, while I was busy, life passed me by. Now I was actually quoting from Seneca
Oh, I see. Mhm.
because and I tried to figure out what Seneca meant by this. I mean, if somebody lived a life, it was Seneca. He was the leading intellectual of the Roman Empire, a poet and playwright. He was the advisor to the emperor, and the emperor was incompetent, so he was actually running the empire. And then he had an affair with the emperor's wife, and then he had to flee. Now, if somebody lived a life, boy, he lived a life. So why is he saying that when I was busy, life passed me by? But that is in a very, I mean, kind of a troublesome thought that always goes through I think I'm not alone. Seneca is not alone, but many of us go with that thought in our mind. And that's to figure out what it is that life is that passed you by when you were busy.
What a beautiful way to light the spark in everyone in the audience to make every moment matter, to make every moment matter. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful and really looking forward to seeing what the next act of creation is from you in our work and in our times. And I'm so grateful that you took time to work on that memoir, and so beautiful to hear as well how much it has been a rewarding journey of meaning making and self-discovery for you, just as much as it has shed more light into the thinking, the striving, the life, the times of someone who I think to me really embodies this much needed potentiality and capacity today to blend the material with the spiritual, to bring a certain wholeness and a moral center and a conscience driven sort of approach towards everything we do, and yet go and conquer the mountains that we all are so ambitious about in the world, but from the right intention. So wishing you really well in your work, in your writing, in your journey, in that time between 6 and noon, and the rest of your time as well in the day, and cheering on your wife as well for being, I'm sure, a huge shaper and force of support and helping you, trek this beautiful path that you've taken, Gurcharanji. Such a joy to have you here with us.
Thank you.